I'd like to ask the speakers to come up and sit up front so that they can see their questioners. And let's give them another round of applause. Wonderful presentation today. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Mike, you had a question?
We encourage everybody not to pay your war taxes as a way of helping to dismantle the military machine that is operating out of this country. If you want information on how to become a war tax resistor, that is how not to pay your war taxes. You can do it both legally and illegally. Contact the War Resisters League in Manhattan. It's like Leo Tolstoy said, you know, if everybody refused to pay their taxes, there wouldn't be any wars and the governments would not stand. They can't put everybody in prison, and even if they could, they still wouldn't have the money to finance their wars. So please consider being a war tax resistor and not paying your taxes on the 17th.
Yes, please.
The use of surveillance drones on the U.S.-Mexican border has become more profitable than anything else that's going on in the Southwest. On Thursday evening, we will have a conversation sponsored by the Latin American Committee of Brooklyn for Peace about what's going on in the border, its relation to immigration issues, its relation to the profitability of these war corporations. So if anybody's interested, I have the information. And I'd like to hear comments on surveillance use. You've talked a lot about the use for bombing. But are there any other specific examples besides the U.S.-Mexico border of how the drones are being used for surveillance purposes?
I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch, you know, the drone videos of various protests that have gone on in London. I mean, this is clearly the wave of the future, is this. You know, I didn't pick the Panopticon, you know, for nothing. It's really, this is the goal, is to keep everybody all the time under complete monitoring. So anything that resembles political fill in the blank is going to be monitored, and that's the miniaturization of the drones and the fact that they're able to get into places, you know, fly around and get to places, makes it much easier to monitor what's going on. I mean, obviously, for instance, you know, the Israelis are doing this all over Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, it is completely routine at this point for there to be dozens and dozens of drones all the time in those airspaces. And there's nothing, of course, the Palestinians at the moment can do about it. Although, as I say, I suspect that's going to change soon.
More information on how the drones will be used against us as American citizens?
One of the things that's recently happened is that the Obama administration has seen to it that the Federal Aviation Authority, by the year 2015, has to make it possible, has to figure out the rules so that drones can pretty much have access to U.S. airspace of all sizes. This includes, right now there are prototypes at every level. There are prototypes that are about to come online that can be controlled by an iPhone. And this goes along with the U.S. military's warfighting plans now are very much based on training new soldiers through video games and iPhone and iPad technology. So this goes along with how they're going to be training and using that technology in the field. Surveillance specifically is very hard to pin down because, as David referred to, corporate interests are going to be able to use these drones, right? People are going to be able to buy them. I suppose Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church could buy its own drone after 2015 and surveil Fort Greene Park. We have no clue how far this is going to go, and it is really extremely alarming when you have a government that already feels and does read all of our email, our mail, and our phone conversations. So the government has the privacy and we don't have any.
I should say that when this legislation was passed that would allow the drones in U.S. airspace, law enforcement agencies on all levels were part of lobbying for that. And there is drone technology being developed by the Air Force specifically for urban areas that is much more of a high definition and thoroughgoing radar than what's used for this kind of really primitive eyeball. And they're also developing weapons that are specific for urban areas that have less, they call it collateral damage. So we have a technology that police are using in a limited way now in Houston and other places that they're very eager to get throughout the United States. And so when you magnify the police misconduct and put it through the, you know, the technology of that's less perfect than face-to-face, but gives you the opportunity to get rid of a problem, you can see that this legislation that was passed should have had restrictions on carrying weapons and drones, should have had restrictions on surveillance. This legislation has no restrictions on any of that. These drones under this law can carry weapons and can watch whatever they want. So this is one reason why we're out here now at this moment to try to put a stop to that. We believe there should be an international ban on weaponized drones and on drone surveillance because of what David was saying. This panopticon is a weapon in itself. It creates a virtual prison for people legitimated by this particular law and what Glenn is talking about. Yes, ma'am.
After surveillance of us.
A couple of things. There is a section in the book that does talk about some of this. It's all very recent. In fact, the legislation that was passed was February 14th, and it said within 90 days, so we have until May 14th, they have to make the airspace available for small drones. Those are 4.4 pound drones, very small drones that could only go up to 400 feet. That's the beginning. And that's to get people used to seeing drones around and thinking that drones are going to be used for all kinds of good things. Then we'll see the bigger drones, and they're talking about like 30,000 drones being in the U.S. skies by 2015. You will still have to get permission to be using a drone. Who will be getting the permission? It's going to be the police departments. Every police department wants drones. So as I said earlier, while they're all talking about these wonderful humanitarian uses for drones and uses for drones that the funny thing going around the internet is this taco company that says we want to send you your lunch by drone, and UPS wants to use drones and all these people. It's going to be law enforcement that first and foremost has the use of drones. And Zora said to mention that that we have to recognize that drones have already been used to kill U.S. citizens. There is the case of in Yemen. Of al-Awlaki, Anwar al-Awlaki, it was killed with another American and his son 3 weeks later. I mean, if we can kill a 16-year-old American born in Denver without an outcry in the United States, why should we think it would be so far out to think about drones killing us here at home? And they are already talking about non-lethal weapons being used by the police department with the drones. So we have a lot to fear about what's going to be coming out of this legislation, not the legislation, how the legislation is going to be translated by the FAA. And I think that's one of the reasons that we called the Drone Summit at the end of April, is to get together and say, okay, what can we do to try to influence this before it is enacted in 2015.
And what conclusion did you come to about what we can do besides
Well, we haven't had the drone summit yet. That is at the end of April, and I encourage everybody here to come because it's going to be the first time that this wide array of people, we have somebody here, is Peter here? Peter, with the group called ICRAC that has a lot of members of it that are scientific experts, and they tell us, if you think what we got now is scary, wait till you see this development of the technology so that you don't even have the human in the loop. You have totally autonomous drones. We have people coming from overseas who have been looking at the issues firsthand of the drone victims. We have people who have been involved in international conventions who are going to talk about how can we move towards an international convention on the use of drones. So this is a plug for those of you who can get yourself down to Washington, D.C. Remember, it's a $20 bus ride to come and join us, because Sunday is totally devoted to a strategy session to think about what we can do. And so one of the things that we can do is a campaign to get drones out of the hands of the CIA, at least, and that is this petition here that's going around. If you haven't signed it, please do so.
Facing another election very soon, they're not going to be talking about this. They're going to be talking about whether gay people should have the right to marry, or whether teenagers should get contraception, or whether people can own guns. They're not going to be talking about drones and the erosion of civil liberties and warrantless wiretapping and the right of the United States government to assassinate, targeted assassinations of even United States citizens, not to mention, everybody else in the world. So I think it's very important that, we talk about this wherever we can, because I suspect that the same thing is going to happen in 2012 that happened in 2008. There's going to be this huge tidal wave to overlook these things and say, well, Obama's a much better guy than whoever he's running against. And so this is something we should be braced for. The most recent thing that I saw in the press hasn't been mentioned, and that is the attempt to develop nuclear-powered drones. And of course, they crash a lot. So when a nuclear-powered drone crashes, what are the repercussions? I mean, just to kind of gild the lily of the problem.
I think this question's for Nick. You've done some research about companies that are building drones. Isn't it true that there's a company in the Navy Yard here that's getting involved with drone development, and also the role of Ed Towns, one of the Congress people from Brooklyn, on the drones committee? If you could comment a little more, please.
Right. Just very briefly, there is a company called Ater. They make a kind of parasail drone, which is essentially a glider that has a motor but is operated from the ground, near or far away. They are used to drop munitions into certain places. When I called his office, I wanted to know why his membership in the Drone Caucus wasn't mentioned along with his other caucus memberships, and his aide said, well, we don't list all of our caucuses. And I said, well, why is he on it? And she said, well, it's because of this Ater company down in the Navy Yard. And she said, oh, it's because Ater can drop medical supplies to our troops. So there is this constant wish to totally whitewash, sugarcoat, and make palatable some really deadly, devastating behaviors. And Brooklyn for Peace very wisely has created postcards to send to Ed Towns asking him to resign from this drone caucus, and I think they can, hook you up with that. But he definitely deserves to get a lot of phone calls about this, and I thank you for bringing that up. Ma'am, you had a question?
Taking off of what Naomi said, I think it is really important that in addition to the activist work that we do, the movement work we do, this wonderful idea of showing this drone thing in the community, getting people to be aware of how terrible it is and what's coming down the line, that one of the things we do, in addition, is that we run candidates that are not in the Democratic Party, that are explicitly anti-war, that raise these issues. in the areas in Brooklyn where our Congress people are not speaking up for what we believe, but for what the corporations believe. But we want to say that, you know, as elections go forward, that we think the only way really to challenge this is to be able to run candidates in addition to all the other work that we do. So we invite people to do that, either as a Green or as an independent. We are happy to help them with our ballot line.
I was going to ask the speakers, Zumba and others, to address this, I think, very insidious argument that is being pitched to liberals and to progressives, right? Because it's easier for liberal and progressive.
Could you explain what that is behind that?
I think the op-ed, the argument was that drones should be used for human rights advocacy and to detect human rights abuses. And the first place that they suggested drones be deployed to monitor for human rights abuses is in Syria. So this is the argument that was placed, and it began circulating in a lot of nominally progressive and anti-war even circles. And I think it's easier for people in this room to articulate opposition against drones used for war and for belligerent ends. But I think equally we need to be aware and on guard for arguments, for supposedly progressive arguments for the use of drones. And this is partly responding to something Medea said, and I'm sure she absolutely doesn't support, you know, this op-ed, but that, or maybe not. I think it's worth discussing that the idea that, well, you know, this technology could be used for positive ends. Should not be used for war making and dropping bombs, but should it be used for the sort of advocacy being promoted here, which I actually think is quite dangerous.
Yeah, and you know, I was going to wait until everybody had their questions before I took the opportunity to disagree with my colleague who disagreed with me about whether anything earth-shaking has happened. I think the question shows that some very earth-shaking things have happened. And what the biggest evidence of something earth-shaking having happened is that we have this humanitarian interventionist doctrine, which seeks to be a substitute for international law that allows violations of the sovereignty of nations like Syria, such as that organization is suggesting, the camel getting his head under the tent one way or another. Of course, these humanitarian drones can turn into deadly drones at any moment, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that their mission is they are violating the sovereign rights of a country. That is what has happened here. I think we could talk about it almost like in terms of the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision said that the slave has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Now, if you saw all this as just a straight line, you could say, well, nothing changed with the Dred Scott decision because slaves had been treated as if they had no rights that a white man was bound to respect for hundreds of years. So what's all this fuss about the Dred Scott decision? Well, it said that that was the law of the land, and that everybody in the United States had to respect the South's legal position that the slave had no right that a white man was bound to respect. And it was a big deal, and the Civil War came only 4 years later because it was a big deal. This humanitarian military interventionist loophole, actually it's superimposed on the rubble of international law, is like that. What it seeks to say is that no nation in the world has any rights that the United States is bound to respect. And that whole edifice of post-World War II prohibitions on aggression, the creation of a body of laws very elegantly that stated that the highest crime that a country can commit, you know, countries commit crimes, and the highest crime that a country can commit is to wage war against peace. And it defined what that meant by defining what the rights of nations were and what you cannot do to nations, such as interfere in their internal affairs, that you must respect their sovereignty and the integrity of governments, to have the right to have a monopoly in the use of force within their own country, just like our own government has. So you can't even define peace if you can't define what the rights of nations are. But the United States now, in this regime, says that these nations have no rights, and therefore we can't even talk about what is peace and what is not, and what are crimes against peace. We are in a lawless situation, and something profoundly different has changed. And I'll just give one more example. The reason for all of these UN declarations and Geneva conferences is to make it harder for aggressors to wage war against peace. It doesn't stop them, but it makes it harder. It puts some speed bumps in the road. That's all we can really do, that we engage people in a dialogue about what is forbidden and what is not. That's what human beings do. And if we had this Obama doctrine now, and I'm calling it his doctrine not because he invented it, but because he has so embraced it and integrated it into the whole U.S. Diplomacy and military posture in the world. If we had had this doctrine in the 1960s, there would have been no need for a Tonkin Gulf incident where the United States manufactured a North Vietnamese attack on warships in order to justify their aggressions against Vietnam. All the United States would have had to do is say, well, we don't like that regime. And that regime is mean to its people, and it puts some people in education camps, and it takes property from people, and that really is not very humane. And that's all it would have to say. And that speed bump, that break against aggression would be gone. Well, that is the situation we have today. Something has really changed. Thank you.
Let me just comment a little further. Look, the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, I think everybody in this room will accept, is the latest version of imperialism. That's what it is. You know, the so-called right to protect or duty to protect is really a duty to protect the existing order of things. Obviously, what should I say? The better news is that there's been some resistance among the various powers, particularly China and Russia, to this, the application of this doctrine, having been burned in Libya over exactly this. I mean, with a made-up set of massacres that were going on in the midst of a civil war with a power that the United States was not particularly wild about, namely Gaddafi. The doctrine has not yet reached universal acceptance, which is a good thing, and we should be, forthright in saying it's a good thing. And I think that as well, we want to be very clear that what's going on in Syria has got to be a problem for all of us, right? There is a government that is killing a lot of its people. It is an undemocratic government. However, the United States was utterly silent in 1982, I believe, when the father of the present leader managed to kill 15,000 people in Homs. And it was okay. It was, that was the government that was there. It was okay for the Iraqi government, after the United States had done what it needed to do, to kill tens of thousands of people who rose up in resistance, when the United States was actually running Iraqi airspace right after it had defeated the Iraqis in Kuwait. All of that is okay when it's done with, American government approval. This is a long-standing imperial notion that has been there. And I actually think that, we should all take, as I say, we should take some comfort by the fact that there is at least some resistance on the international scene to this idea that the United States, as Glenn was saying, really gets to call the shots without any regard for law. And it is a good thing that these folks, for instance, were compelled to try to pull the wool over our eyes with surveillance drones. With that said, the fact of the matter is many of us have been in favor of doing things like getting video cameras to people in Bahrain who are being attacked by their government, and that it's clear that we want to document the abuses of human rights. To the extent that you can use drone technology to do that, maybe that's a good thing. Just, I want to be very clear that I agree that, the technology is not per se the evil. The evil is the social relations, and the evil is imperialism.
So I agree with David on that, and I think this is part of what we have to discuss more, and I hope at the Drone Summit we do that, because I do see drones being used in a positive way by people in the environmental community. I see people going out on the high seas trying to find the whaling ships, very hard to find in the high seas, using it to find them for illegal whaling and stopping the illegal whaling. Something that the drone community likes to put out a lot is how drones were used after the Fukushima nuclear power plant contamination to go in where it would have been very dangerous for pilots to see the level of contamination. People talk a lot about forest fires, that if you had drones over vast extenses of land that could see where a forest fire was starting, you could quickly try to stop that. So I think there are positive uses of drones, like, just like saying, is there a positive use of an airplane? But the important thing is to think it out very clearly. What are positive uses and what are uses that are just plain bad, evil, and try to make a distinction, have regulations about that.
So yeah, the technology is probably neutral, but then you have social relations, which, and I just don't know which organizations would be able to afford a drone, and would you really want to put that much money into a humanitarian organization owning a drone? And I just think that it's unrealistic to think that this would ever be used for good. Maybe theoretically, I just think that empirically it's not going to work.
There's a fundamental difference between what a nation does and what an individual does. If you want to go to Syria or any place else and take your chances and help whatever side you want, I have no problem with that. That's your right, and you're taking your chances. What the U.S. government does is supposed to be within the parameters of international law. What all nations do is supposed to be within the parameters of international law. So private people's use of drones is one thing. Nations' use of drones to infiltrate other people's national territory is something entirely different. Just like the cops don't have the right to do some things that you do in terms of surveilling your neighbors.
It's kind of like Obama's stance, with the National Defense Authorization Act, and the people that have to make that get the chance to make that decision, they're the people that are powerful. They're the people that usually use that power in detrimental ways. They're not the people that are going to use that power to be humanitarian, to be good.
The U.S. government throughout history has often created fictions to justify going to war. I'm thinking about the medical students in Grenada. I'm thinking of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I'm thinking about the Spanish-American War. If there is a technology that the U.S. is so ubiquitously using that says that conclusively they have photographs of everything that is going on everywhere, how could something like the display that happened with the weapons of mass destruction occur? So my question is, if this much information, your panopticon, is sitting in somebody's room, how can they continue to create fictions? When do they become accountable to share that information as part of a democratic or international discussion?
The idea that somehow that more knowledge will make them accountable, it's just not true, and it won't happen. Whatever the pictures are, if there's a social need to lie about it, they will be lied about. It's not the first time that pictures lie. That's what photography has been about to a great extent, and will be continually, and that's the way it's going to be used. Again, the technology is not, to me, the major issue. It's the social relations behind it, the fact that the government will lie. That's, as I.F. Stone says, that's what governments do. They lie. And they will lie about war, and this government will lie about war, period. They can say that they've got proof positive of the weapons of mass destruction from, a guy who was tortured in Uzbekistan, or, a guy who's trying to spin them for the benefit of a couple of bankers. The government will take the intelligence that it wants to, will take the pictures that it wants to. It will ultimately do what it wants unless we can figure out a way to stop it.
Well, Zora, I'd like to just have you comment on the ACLU's difficulty in getting information about what is in the possession of the government right now.
Basically, the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government for not disclosing the rationale for killing the Yemeni citizen who was assassinated, and for not giving enough information on the intelligence that the government uses. And the basis of the lawsuit is that you can't allow, the New York Times can't comment on the drone program, Eric Holder can't comment on the drone program publicly, and yet assert when one makes a request formally that it's somehow secret. It's an inconsistency. So that's the basis of the lawsuit.
That concludes our program for today. And I think that it's a very important conclusion because we have to fight for our rights to know as well as to fight for our rights for privacy, fight for our rights against oppression of police in various places. At some point, we all have to ask ourselves, where do we get the energy to fight? And are we bouncing off the ropes enough? And I think that that's really what we're talking about today. So thank you for coming.